We're in the second week of a sermon series titled Life in the Lion's Den. It's on the book of Daniel. I want to start off with this question, which is, how do you respond when your life is threatened? How do you respond when something has come along, whether it be a health diagnosis or a financial issue, a rupture in a relationship, something has come along and the way that you thought you were going to live, the story that you thought you were going to have, that has become threatened. Perhaps that has become impossible. And now you have to answer the question, how are you going to respond? Psychologists say that we're hardwired to either fight or flight. That deep into our nervous system and into like our brain, we are just have an automatic response of either fighting, like I'm just going to give it back to them what they gave to me, and it's time like to put up your dukes sort of thing, or we just run. And sometimes you can't physically run away from a problem, and so you run emotionally. You shut down. You avoid it. Last week we talked about this guy, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Epiphanes means God manifests because he has an ego problem. People called him Epimanes, which means mad one because he was crazy. And Antiochus was the ruler of the Syrian Greek Empire. So he's actually a descendant of Alexander the Great, one of his generals. So how many of you heard of Alexander the Great? Probably don't remember much about him, but you've heard of him. He dies in 323, and his empire, which was larger than anybody had ever seen at that point in time, gets split among his generals. And Antiochus is one of the descendants about 150 years later. He's ruling. And he's notable to us because in 168, he has this violent oppression of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. He basically outlaws Judaism. There's no longer sacrifice in the temple. Circumcision is not allowed. If you circumcise your child, which is a big part of the Jewish religion, you would be killed, and everybody involved would be killed as well. It was violent, it was terrible, and he was just extremely offensive. He sacrificed pigs on the altar in the temple. Jesus referred to it generations later as the abomination desolation. Great name for a heavy metal band. Covered that last week. So this was a huge event in the life of the Jewish people. And there was a group that responded with fight. They said, we're not going to take it. There's a man named Mattathias. He was a country priest of the Jewish religion. And Antiochus' officials were sent from town to town, village to village, to make sure everybody was offering sacrifices to the Greek god of Zeus. And he comes to Mattathias and he says, why don't you go first because you're respected? But Mattathias says, there's no way I'm going to do that, and my sons won't do it either. And then one of his fellow Israelites chooses flight. He gives in and he offers a sacrifice. And right there in that moment, Mattathias takes matters into his own hands. He kills the Israelite and kills Antiochus' official and sparks the Maccabean Revolution. And it's called the Maccabean Revolution because one of his sons, one of the priest's sons, is Judas, but he gets the nickname Maccabeus, which means hammer. If you remember last week, we did hammer time. Yeah, because I want to make that point, right? Somebody, if you got the nickname hammer, does that suggest that you're gentle and easygoing? Probably not. And Judas wasn't. He was a military genius, and they did quite amazing. In fact, they revolted in 167, and by 129, the Israelites have independent Jewish rule in the Holy Land for the first time in over 400 years. It's a big, big deal. But the problem is that the Maccabean Revolution was almost as violent as Antiochus. If you read 1 Maccabees, and I read to you from it last week, you'll see that they engaged in their own forced conversions. They hunted down anybody that was a traitor, anybody that colluded with the Syrian Greeks. And here's the thing. When you respond to violence with violence, you become violent. And the Maccabees, they respond to the violence of the Greeks. How do you respond when your life is threatened? They choose fight, and they respond with violence, and they are as violent as Antiochus and his army. And the average person who's living in the midst of this, I mean, there's just like you're between a rock and a hard place. And we live in a day and age where most of us have learned the myth of redemptive violence. The idea that, when the good guy uses violence, somehow that's going to redeem things and everything's going to be okay. Every single action film I grew up on, from Rambo to Commando to Die Hard, all of them had this theme. I love those movies. But they were pushing forward a lie. Because if you actually read history, the truth of the matter is a cycle of violence. And the good guys justify their violence by saying they're the good guys, and it just goes on and on and on. When your life is threatened, how are you going to respond? Are you going to run? Are you going to flight? Are you going to give in? Or are you going to fight? Both of them are problematic. What if there was a third way? What if there was a way to respond to evil without becoming evil yourself? It's so easy to fall into that tit for tat. Maybe it's not physical violence, but emotional violence, right? You have that car ride home, and you're just giving that person what for, and you're just so angry with them, and they're not even in the car, right? Or you give that verbal violence. They say something mean to you, and you're like, oh, you want to go there? Like, I can do mean words too. What if there was a third way, a way to respond to evil without becoming evil, a way to respond to that violence without becoming violent, and a way to be faithful without fleeing? The book of Daniel presents this third way. So we're going to start in the first chapter of the book of Daniel. And Daniel is 12 chapters long. We were actually in the 11th chapter last week. But today we'll start in the first chapter, and we're going to get the setting of the author, or setting of the story. And we need to pause for a moment. I just need to talk about the difference between the setting of a story and the setting of an author. Okay? So you have the setting of the authors and the setting of the story. So ignore that for a moment. Just look at me. I could tell a story about the 1770s, about a group of revolutionaries who dump a bunch of tea into the Boston Harbor. You all know what I'm talking about? Right? That's the setting of the story. But the setting of the author is what? It's Indianapolis, 2019. Okay? And I might tell that story about the Boston Tea Party because of things going on today. It'd be an allegory. And so what I'm proposing to you, scholars are split about what's the real deal. There's always debate when it comes to the Bible. But last week we talked about Antiochus and the Maccabees. Next slide. And that's the setting of the authors. There's a group of scholars that I find very persuasive that say that the book of Daniel was finally collected and edited and created in the form that we read it today in the mid-2nd century under the pressures of Antiochus, who has criminalized the Jewish religion, and the Maccabees, who have revolted against Antiochus, and you're either with them or against them. That was the way they rolled. And so what they do is something brilliant. They tell a story back at another time that was really difficult for the Israelites, which was the exile in Babylon. When the Babylonian Empire came in 606, they began to siege the city, and by 587, they've destroyed the temple. It was a notable time for the Israelite people. Everyone who heard the reference to the exile in Babylon immediately would have all sorts of emotions that would arise around that. Just like if I said to you, 9/11, Twin Towers. It's a moment in recent American history that all of us have a feeling about. And the reason they do this, and I made this point last week, is simply this. A story of faithfulness in the past can empower faithfulness in the present. And so if you are trying to get through something right now, one thing you can do, and this was the takeaway, the application from last week, one thing you can do is think about a time in your past when you went through something difficult and somehow you made it through. Somehow God was faithful, you were faithful, and you've been there before. And that can empower your faithfulness in the present. And as a collective community, we can tell stories about faithfulness in the past to help us get through difficult times in the present. That is what is going on. That's the motivation behind the book of Daniel. Y'all following? Yeah. All right, so let's get into the book of Daniel. In the 3rd year, roughly 606 BC, of the reign of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, that's the king of the Israelites, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. He's coming in to take over. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. In 167, Antiochus comes into the temple and he ransacks the temple and takes things out of it. And here's a story about Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, going into the temple and doing what? Taking things out of it. You see the parallels? Now, who delivers Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hands? Who? It's on there. It's in yellow. The Lord. The Lord, okay? That might be a little confusing, but it gets to a theme that's critical to understanding Daniel. And the theme is this. Despite how it seems, God is still in control. Over and over in the book of Daniel, despite how it seems, Daniel behaves in ways that asserts that God is still in control. And that gives Daniel incredible resilience in the face of extreme difficulty. And in your life, if you can come to believe this, that despite the circumstances, despite the story, and you have a story, but despite what's going on, that indeed the God of grace revealed to us through Jesus Christ is in control, that will do something for you. And I know, for all of us, that's a leap. That's a leap. So going back to the scripture, the things from the temple, he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia in the region of Shinar. And oh my goodness, there's so much going on with this reference to Shinar. And you'll have to come back next week to hear about it. And he put in the treasure of his house of his God. So he's taken all the things from Yahweh, the Israelite God's temple, and he's put them in his own temple. Offensive, demoralizing, this is bad. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, great names in the story, Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family. Bring me the best of the best. Nebuchadnezzar had this thing that he liked to take like the kings and the royalty of the conquered nations and make them his servants. Pretty cruel, but it's wise. These are the educated people. So, among those who were chosen were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief officials gave them new names. They get Babylonian names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. And every year, I feel like I meet somebody that's having a baby and a baby boy, and I'm always confused. Why don't they choose the name Belteshazzar? Great name, right? Yeah, rolls off the tongue. To Hananiah, he gets the name Shadrach. Mishael gets the name Meshach. Azariah gets the name Abednego. Let's say it together. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Someday soon, I'm going to adopt 3 cats. I'm going to name them Shadrach, Meshach, and Bob. It's going to be awesome. So here's the story. We have these captive Israelites, and they're brought to Nebuchadnezzar. And he says, you're going to learn the language of Babylon. You're going to learn the literature. We're going to give you Babylonian names. We're going to give you Babylonian clothes. You're going to get food and wine from my own table. You're going to be trained for 3 years. And if you're good enough, you can be my personal servants. That's the situation that Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are in. The king talked with them, so they finished their training. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those are their Hebrew names. So they entered into the king's service. So their training went well. In fact, they're the cream of the crop. Then we're told at the end of chapter 1 that Daniel remained until the first year of King Cyrus, which means nothing to you because you don't know about King Cyrus, probably other than Chuck. King Cyrus is the king or the emperor of the Persian Empire. And when the Persians come in and they overtake the Babylonians, another moment in history that every Israelite would remember and have a reference point in terms of a date comes to mind because he allows the Israelites to go back to their homeland. And so this tells us that Daniel's in captivity for roughly 67 years. And you thought that thing you're dealing with was going on for a long time. But it's Daniel's lifetime. Because he's a man when he gets taken off into exile, probably a very young man. But this means that if he ever returns back to his homeland, and we don't know if he does, maybe he did, but he'd be in his 80s. A lifetime in captivity. So how does he respond? How does he make it through? Why is the story told? What is it that carries him? And it's a combination of these two things: loyalty and subversion. You heard that in the video. Loyalty and subversion. Loyalty because he takes the way that Jeremiah, the prophet, suggests. Here's what Jeremiah says: seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you off into exile. That was probably not a very popular statement. But Jeremiah says, look, build homes, have weddings, get married, have children, plant gardens. You're going to be there a while. And seek the peace and prosperity of that place. That's what we're to do. But at times, there's times to be subversive. There's times to take a stand. And we're going to look at those. The first one we're going to look at today, where Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in chapter 1, they're proactive about taking a stand, proactive about engaging in a form of worship of their God, the true God, the God of Israel. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will decline to worship the empire. We'll talk about that next week. And they'll get thrown into the fire, which is what Jason was talking about when he was singing, into the fire. And somehow they make it out. And then finally, there's a third stand that Daniel takes where he refuses again to worship the power of the king, and that's the famous Daniel in the lion's den. They're going to take a stand. They're going to be loyal, but there's some times in life where you have to say, this is my boundary, and I rather die, or I rather lose the job, or lose the friendship, or whatever it is, than cross this line. Because it's essential to be a person of integrity, to not lose yourself. So let's look at what Daniel does. It says, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. What's going on here? Well, if you know anything about the Torah and the 613 laws that define the people of Israel, a big section of those laws is about food. Through their diet, the Israelites showed their spiritual dedication. Through their diet, they showed their belief and loyalty to God. And so Daniel thinks, hey, you know what, maybe in this powerless situation, I can find a little bit of power here. In this situation where it feels like God has abandoned me, and there's this like all-powerful, king, the king Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, who's changed my name, changed the way I dress, changed everything about my life and those around me. Maybe one thing, I can take a little bit of control, and I can worship God in this way. So he asked for permission. And the guy is reluctant to do it. Here's what he says. I'm afraid of my lord, the king, Nebuchadnezzar, who assigned you your food. He said that you're supposed to eat it, and you don't go against the king. And if he sees that you're looking worse for the wear because you haven't been eating the meat and potatoes and drinking the wine and all that sort of thing, then he is going to have my head. Because that's how it works in Babylon. That's what happens when rulers get infatuated with their own power. They just heads roll. We'll see that throughout the story. They become subhuman. They become like a beast. And this guy's afraid. So Daniel, he's a sensitive, wise person. He says this: please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who ate the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. Let's just run a little experiment here. I get you're under pressure. We're all under the thumb of Nebuchadnezzar. So can we run a little test? At the end of 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So they're just eating vegetables and water. Any vegetarians in the room? You love this passage, don't you, right? The vegetarians are looking better. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them the vegetables instead. Okay, so there's a little story right there in the beginning of Daniel. To these 4 men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. So what happens here is that Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they decide to take a little bit of control back, a little bit of power back, but for the purpose of worshiping and honoring God, they add something positive into their life while they're experiencing a whole lot of negative. They decide to start something new or to hold on to something in the midst of everything else kind of falling around them. And there's a benefit. And I think in your life, it could be the same. That sometimes when life is out of control in so many other places, to stop and say, what positive thing can I hold on to, or what positive thing can I add that will benefit you? And if you do it for a motivation, not just for yourself, but out of a declaration that God is still in control despite what the circumstances seem, if you do it that like God is still a good God, that there's still reason to hope, even more the benefit. And I think that's key. We can go right past, but why does Daniel choose to ask to have a different diet? It's to honor God and say God is still in control. So what do? You take a stand. We have fight and we have flight, but there's a third way, and it starts by taking a stand and defining, here is where I'm going to be. And what Daniel does is he is proactive in finding some way to have power in a powerless situation. So in your life, you're responsible to figure out where to take a stand. Then, this is brilliant, he tests it. Okay? He could be wrong. This could be maybe the wrong move. And so Daniel, he's willing to experiment with possible ways to improve his situation. You might take a stand in a circumstance and then find out that it's not producing the results that you were hoping for. So you experiment. You might change your tactics. And then finally, you trust God. And I think that this is the secret to it all, because beneath it is this deep sense in the hopefulness provided by a good and gracious God that is in control despite what the circumstances may say. So he trusts God, and he demonstrates his spiritual dedication through his diet. I've been pretty open that I'm in a time that is a sense of exile, at least upheaval in my life, and my schedule is different, and the pressures on me are different. And I feel super busy. And I feel myself getting fatigued. And I kind of know what to do. I need to exercise. Because if I exercise, I'll have more energy and more clarity to do the work that I'm called to do at home and here. And specifically, I always find that if I go and practice yoga, that really helps. There's something about the community and that form of exercise that helps. Except for it's hot room yoga, so I sweat for like an hour and a half afterwards. And so I got to like dedicate this block of time that I really feel like I don't have. But I need it. You ever been in this situation? You know you need to do something, but you don't have the time for it. You keep putting it off and putting it off. So I went on Tuesday, and I was thinking, what am I going to preach about? And then I was there. And I thought to myself, yeah, I'm here because I believe in the health benefits of this practice. But it's bigger than that. I'm here because I believe that I need to do what I can do, and that, hey, I'm never going to have enough time to do everything. Anybody ever feel that way? And so I just need to do what God is leading me to do. He's been nudging me. And so this practice today, that's what I was thinking last Tuesday, this is about my belief, my dedication, spiritual dedication to my God, who, despite what the circumstances may say, is in control. And I can trust him. So here we go. How do you respond when your life is threatened? You take a stand. You test it. And you trust God. Let us pray. Lord, we thank you for this remarkable story of Daniel. We thank you for the third way that he shows us, and that we will explore in the weeks to come. This way of being in the world that is ultimately adopted by Jesus, who shows us its power. So for those that are here today that find themselves in between a rock and a hard place, find themselves facing something that seems threatening to their lives, that is indeed threatening to their life, God, I just hope that today's message would inspire them to be like Daniel, to be proactive in doing something good and positive in their life, to take back a little bit of control, a little bit of power, but do it for the motivation and the purpose of claiming your power in their lives. Pray all this in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ.